All right, guys. Sorry that last one cut off right there. We just got just another slide or two left, so we'll finish up real quick. But this is Long-Term Causes of the Civil War, Part 4, the final edition. So let's pick up where we left off. Kind of recap real quickly here, refresh your memory. In 1833, in Virginia, a slave named Nat Turner rises up and leads a rebellion against his slave owners in the surrounding county there. It was a major slave rebellion. And actually, just to kind of give you some background information on this, Nat Turner, obviously, like most slaves, he was not overly well educated. So he actually interpreted a solar eclipse. Imagine it. So if you're watching a solar eclipse happen and you've never really studied astronomy or science, anything like that, you're going to think that is some sort of divine act. And Nat Turner, he's pretty much interpreted that way. He saw it as a sign from God, a message from God that he needed to rise up against his slave masters and lead a rebellion for their freedom. So they rise up, major slave rebellion, end up killing around 55 whites, mostly women and children. And of course, after this, the Southerners are absolutely going to flip their junk. They are already hated the abolitionist movement because you're trying to take my slaves away, but they never really took it all that seriously because it was removed from them up north. But now that the abolitionist movement has kind of reached down and the Southerners have felt their effect with this rebellion, they're going to begin to outright fear the abolitionist movement as something that's dangerous and really could be a threat to their way of life and a threat to their lives in general. As you can see, 55 white people were killed in Nat Turner's rebellion. So this is going to breed even more distrust and dislike between the North and the South. And it's really going to kind of further divide the sections because the Southerners just do not trust the Northerners. They see the Northerners as basically out to destroy them and their way of life. And they're also going to really begin to even more so distrust the federal government, thinking that the federal government favors the North and does not really have the best interests of the Southern states at heart. And really probably the worst part of all this for the Southern slaves is that it kind of backfires, this rebellion. Since it was a failed rebellion, now the Southerners are going to be even stricter and harsher in the slave codes that they impose on their slaves to keep them in line, to make sure that no rebellion like this could ever possibly happen again in the future. They're just going to do everything they can to keep them in line. And that also means harsher treatment, more strict treatment, harsher punishments. So that the quality of life, the quality of life for a slave was never good. Let's not make no mistake about it. I mean, you're a slave, you're in bondage. But now life is just going to suck a little bit more for a slave because the Southerners want to take it out on you and make sure to keep you in line, make you feel like you have no rights, that you are essentially not a human. So those are the major effects of Nat Turner's rebellion. Well, the Northerners have a different way of viewing all of this is going on. Now, this is kind of where we kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier in one of the other episodes of this. Abolitionists, although most of them lived in the North, they were pretty unpopular in many areas north, especially among the working class Northerners, or middle class, lower class, working class part of the North. Because think about it, those textile mills depended on Southern cotton. You can have all the mills and all the factories you want in the North, but they don't mean anything. They're not worth anything unless you have the Southern cotton, the raw materials, to send up there to put into those mills. So there's a connection there. And the Southerners is kind of vice versa. Southerners can grow all the cotton they want, but that cotton's not really worth anything if there's no one that wants the cotton so they can make it into cloth. So there's an interconnectedness there between the Northern and Southern economies. They don't really want to admit that, but it's certainly there. So most of the people in the North view the abolitionists with a little bit of weariness, because if slaves are freed, well, those slaves are going to come up north in large numbers, and they are going to be competition for jobs in the factories. And also you got to factor in too, if slavery is outlawed, well, there's not going to be as much production of cotton in the South because now you don't have that free labor force. If you don't have as much production of cotton in the South, that means there's not as much cotton to go in the textile mills in the North, which then means that Northerners aren't going to be making as much money, because if you don't have as much cotton, you can't make as much cloth. If you don't make as much cloth, you can't sell as much cloth. If you don't sell as much cloth, you don't make as much money. So not everyone in the North, it's kind of a misnomer, not everyone in the North was completely on board this abolition bandwagon. And you also got to factor in that still, even though they saw slavery as kind of an evil institution, most Northern whites were still very racist. They didn't love black people. They wanted to free them because they wanted to be neighbors with them. They wanted to marry them and start families with them. No, they still felt that the white race was superior. So it wasn't that the Southerners were that much more racist. That really wasn't the case at all. They just simply had to have slaves out of an economic necessity. And so let me just mention this as well. Most of the whites up north, they didn't really like slavery. They thought it was an evil institution. But they also were concerned that free blacks would threaten their jobs and also drive the wages down. So if a free black comes up and he's really looking to get his first real job where he's going to get paid for it, he's going to take a lot less than your typical white person up north was. So if a white guy wants a job with free blacks there as competition, they're going to have to accept less, or that job's going to go to the black guy. So that's something that they're not too eager to see. There are also some, to give you kind of an example of some of the views of a lot of the whites up north and how they were not so much in favor of abolition like a lot of people would make it out to be. There were some major mob outbursts where white northerners would attack the major abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison. He was actually dragged through the streets of Boston and beaten in 1835. Reverend Elijah P. Lovejoy was a preacher who was killed after giving an anti-slavery speech. So again, these are just examples to show you that not everyone in the North was in love with the abolitionists. It wasn't like it was unanimous in that feeling in the northern states. So let's quickly here look at the political consequences of slavery. So of course, all this political disagreement would lead to political parties taking a stance on the issue of slavery, and eventually going to have a stance on the Civil War. So let's look at a couple of these political parties in the United States right before the Civil War. So you have the Democrats, we've been talking about. This is Andrew Jackson's party. They see slavery as a states' right issue. They think the states should be allowed to decide whether or not they have slaves. So in the North, they say, okay, most northern states have outlawed slavery. That's their right. That's a state that has a right to do that. Well, a state like Georgia, a state like Virginia down south, they still have slaves. Well, let's make sure that we let them decide for themselves if they want to keep slavery or eventually let it kind of run its course in their states. The Whigs, they didn't come up with a viable solution. The Whig Party, basically, they were kind of divided. There were two wings of the party. One was an anti-slavery party, one was a pro-slavery party. And so since they couldn't really come up with a viable solution together, the party basically is going to dissolve, and it's not going to be a factor moving forward into the Civil War. Yet a new party called the Liberty Party that was formed in 1840, and what they were calling for was an immediate abolition of slavery, immediately get rid of slavery. But like I said, I showed you in the last slide, not everyone, even in the North, not everyone was on board for this idea of immediate abolition. So they didn't really get that many votes and weren't a major factor. There's also a new party called the Free Soil Party. Think about the name, Free Soil. They sought to compromise with the issue of slavery by essentially proposing the idea that slavery is just not going to be allowed to extend into the new territories. So imagine the new territories they gained, like in the Mexican-American War with the Mexican Cession, California, Nevada, Arizona, all those territories. We're not going to let slavery extend into new territories that we're adding in the country, but if a state already has slaves, like in the Southeast, Georgia, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, all those states, well, they already have slaves. It can be allowed to continue in those states, particularly in the Southeast. All right, guys, that is it. And tomorrow we will take a much closer look at the short-term causes of Civil War, leading us right into the actual outbreak of war.